Now that Book 4 of the Stormlight Archive, Rhythm of War, has been out for a couple of months, I've been increasingly interested in making a few theory videos on my predictions for Book 5 of Brandon Sanderson's epic fantasy series. Well, today is the day we discuss a few of those theories and try to make educated guesses at what's going to happen in the next Cosmere novel. Now, as we know, Book 5 is the last of this arc of the Stormlight Archive. Book 6 will be the first of the second arc that takes place at least 10 years after the events of Book 5. So while I feel it's too early for prediction videos on the end of the series, I think a prediction video on the end of the first arc is perfectly doable. If you have any predictions of your own you'd like to voice, I encourage you to put it in the comments below. Let's get an interesting conversation started since I'd love to see what you guys think up. Anyway, let's get to the meat of the video, shall we? Kaladin dies. Okay, so I'm coming right out the gate with a heavy hitter of a theory. And before you dislike and report my video, give me a chance to explain my opinion here. So let me start by saying I don't necessarily want Kaladin to die. I think it's just highly likely that he will. I have about 5 primary reasons for thinking that the next book will see the death of one of the most beloved characters in the Stormlight Archive. The first is that Brandon has clearly set Kaladin's story in a direction away from him seeing combat. He's walking away from the battlefield in a story about a gigantic war. So it seems to me that it makes perfect sense to give him a proper send-off in one final fight. Perhaps he decides to fight one last time and ends up dying to protect someone close to him. The second reason I think Kaladin will die is not only is he walking away from the battle, but is also beginning to walk the road of recovery from depression. Now, of course, one doesn't ever fully recover from clinical depression like he has, but he's in a much better place now and his internal struggles are beginning to quiet down a bit. He's helping other depressed people and I can totally see him establishing a mental health facility or something similar before passing. The third reason is that Kaladin's arc is, in general, coming to a close here. He's forgiven himself for Tien's death. He and his father are finally seeing eye to eye again. He's protected everyone he cares about as much as he possibly could. He's grown as a person and is finally moved on from the flaws he once had. It would make sense to end his arc completely in the next book. The fourth reason is that there's a new generation of Radiants coming in the back half of the books. Younger characters who are minor role players now will eventually become the main Radiants of the next books. Not only will Brandon have to cull the current cast of characters, but giving future Radiants a role model in the legendary Stormblessed who saved hundreds and potentially was a martyr in the end would end up making a lot of sense if you think about it. The fifth and final reason I think Sanderson may kill off Kaladin is that it would pack a really tough narrative punch for the end of the next book. Not only for the characters around Kaladin but also for the reader. Imagine just how invested you'd be in the latter half of the series if something as major as Kaladin's death occurred in Book 5. I know I just have to see how things end. Like I said, I don't necessarily want Kaladin to die, but there's a real chance he may just end up doing so. Shallan restores Testament. My next prediction is that I think Shallan may end up being the first Radiant with 2 bonded Spren. Now, Brandon has already confirmed a Radiant can bond more than 1 Spren, but of course that's very rare. And what better way to introduce the possibility to readers than to show it happening with Shallan? Shallan's big reveal in Book 4 was that she actually had a different bonded cryptic Spren when she was a child, but she ended up breaking the bond and turning the Spren into a Deadeye. Now, we've seen Adolin slowly begin to restore Maya from a complete Deadeye to something with some sort of intelligence and autonomy. But consider that Maya was a Deadeye for thousands of years and her original Radiant died long ago. Testament, Shallan's Deadeye cryptic, is different in that the Radiant she bonded is still alive and is still wielding her as a dead Shardblade. So if Shallan manages to restore Testament back from being a Deadeye, the bond would likely reform. If that happened, Shallan would be the first to bond 2 Spren, though both would be cryptic Spren. It would be a perfect way for Brandon to introduce the idea of a Radiant that bonded to Spren without making it confusing with multiple power sets. It also makes a lot of sense with the whole storyline with Adolin and Maya playing out right alongside Shallan discovering Testament and trying to restore her to a full sentience. I'll admit, it's not my strongest argument, but I think it makes sense from a narrative level at least, and unless Brandon Sanderson reveals some different reason for introducing this revelation of her past, I think this is likely where Shallan is headed. Also consider just the personality of Shallan alone. She's a character that's very fragmented and, of course, has multiple personalities. It kind of makes sense for her to be the first Radiant to bond to Spren. Whether they're both cryptic Spren or not, it kind of makes sense on a narrative level as well. And hey, wouldn't it be cool to see a Radiant dual-wielding independent shard blades? I certainly think so. Dalinar loses to Taravodium. Wow, I'm really making this a bummer of a theory video, aren't I? Well, I have to be honest when I say that I genuinely think this is a possibility in the next book. Let's explore why exactly I think this may happen. First of all, the most obvious reason is that if Dalinar ends up beating Taravodium, the agreement states that he has to return to Braze and leave Roshar alone for at least another 1,000 years. And we know the back half takes place only about 10 years later, and having the main antagonist beaten halfway through the series makes very little sense, because then what will the last 5 books be about? So naturally, Taravodium doesn't lose at the end of the next book. Now granted, he could do so and end up using some loophole to get out of leaving Roshar for 1,000 years. But I highly doubt Brandon would set up this ultimate battle just for the loser to not actually face the consequences of losing. Also, why would Brandon elevate Taravangian to a shard at the end of book 4 just to have him leave for 1,000 years at the end of book 5? Seems a bit wasted, doesn't it? The second reason I think Dalinar will lose is because Taravangian deeply understands him on a personal level. Both men saw eye to eye once and understood each other more deeply than many could. And now, with his shard level intelligence and future sight, Taravangian could easily find a way to exploit any of the weaknesses Dalinar has to win. There's a theory made by someone on the 17th Shardcast, I can't remember exactly who made it, but they theorized that Taravangian could pick Gavanor, Dalinar's nephew, as his champion purely because Dalinar would never be able to kill him. He uses the death rattle from A Way of Kings chapter to support it. It reads, "I hold the suckling child in my hands, a knife at his throat. I know that all who live wish me to let the blade slip, spill its blood upon the ground over my hands, and with it gain us further breath to draw." And death rattles have been found to be prophetic in the past, so make of that what you will. The final reason I think Dalinar will lose to Taravodium is that Odium once said that the war on Roshar is merely a taste of what's to come. He said that it is merely a training ground for the great war of the Cosmere to come. He intended to turn Dalinar into his champion to lead his forces in this great Cosmere war. So having Dalinar reluctantly bound to Taravangian and acting as his agent in a large-scale Cosmere war could be a very interesting dynamic. I can already see Dalinar arguing with Taravodium and trying to steer him on the right path while still having to do as he's told. I would of course prefer Dalinar to win since he's my favourite Stormlight Archive character, but I wouldn't put it past Brandon to do this and end up catching a lot of readers off guard. Who knows, maybe Dalinar learns some bondsmithy magic that saves him somehow, but I guess only time will tell. Now, before I continue to the final theories I have, I'd like to ask that you please consider subscribing if you haven't already. I'm currently trying to hit my next goal of 500 subscribers, and everyone towards that goal helps a lot. I upload 3 times a week, so I'm sure you'll find something here to enjoy on a fairly regular basis. Anyway, let's get back to the video, shall we? Moash leaves Taravodium. Okay, so this is my shortest theory in this video, but I feel pretty strongly about it and wanted to get it into the video. If you haven't seen my video on Moash yet, I highly recommend you do so. I think he's a very nuanced character that many people dismiss offhand without considering the larger picture around his actions. And with how Moash lost his sight at the rhythm of war, I think it's a fitting metaphor for how he's been blinded this whole time. I firmly believe that Moash has a redemption arc coming, and the first step to this redemption arc is leaving the service of Terravodium. Now, I don't think he'll end up redeeming himself in the next book. I think it will just be the first step, and that he may only end up doing so near the end of the second half of the series. Hell, maybe he leaves Terravodium, and just as the Shard tries to kill him for the betrayal, Kaladin sacrifices himself to save his old friend. And that sacrifice is what sets Moash on his new path. It would kind of help the two theories I have work together, but of course it is just a theory. I will admit this theory is the one I have the least evidence for, and it's mainly based on a large hunch I have. For me, it just seems like this is the direction that Moash's arc is heading. If you'd like to see exactly why I feel this way about Moash, consider checking out my video I did defending him. I think it's very likely, but I also admit that I might be completely off since I have a lot less support for this one than the others. If you'd like to tell me why you strongly disagree with this theory, please feel free to leave a comment and we can have a discussion about it below. Third faction of Radiants and Singers. So we have the Radiants in Urithiru fighting against the Singers, two factions vying for control of Roshar, each with their own reasons and motivations for doing so. My theory is that we'll also have a third additional faction coming into play. I believe we'll have a third faction made up out of Singers and Radiants working together. Let me explain my reasons behind thinking so. First, we have the plot of Shallan hunting down Bar-Ado-Mishram, the unmade that caused the false desolation. Mishram caused a false desolation around the time of the Recreants when she somehow managed to give Singers forms of power and supply them with void light. Now she didn't bring any fuse back, but she did empower the Singers and make them a stronger force to be reckoned with. So I believe we'll see Shallan finding Bar-Ado-Mishram and releasing her from the prison she was stuck in. Okay, so just what does that have to do with anything, you ask? Well, trust me, it'll make sense in a moment, just let me explain. So in addition to Bar-Ado-Mishram, we have Sha'anat, another unmade who does something interesting in her own right. Sha'anat corrupts Radiant Spren that can bond with potential Radiants. Renarin is one of these, and at the end of Rhythm of War, Relaine becomes one as well. And thanks to a live stream where Brandon basically confirmed it, we know that Relaine and Renarin are likely going to end up together romantically. So we have a couple that are both Radiant with corrupted Radiant Spren. Now just bear with me while I bring these pieces together. We also have a group of Singers at the end of Book 4 that broke off from Odium's forces and went to join the group of listeners and forge their own lives away from the conflict. And at the head of this group stands Venli. So we have an unmade that can grant forms of power independent from Odium. We also have an unmade that can create Radiant Spren that are unique and different from others. We have a couple of Radiants with corrupted Spren that end up in a romantic relationship. Also, bear in mind that one is a human and one is a Parshendi, so we also have the unification of races there. And finally, we have Venli, who has both a form of power and Nahel bond as a Radiant. Put it all together and you have a group of Parshendi separate from Odium's forces with a whole group of Radiant Spren looking to bond them, courtesy of Venli. You also have an unmade who can give these Parshendi forms of power alongside their Radiant bonds. And then you have the Radiant couple with corrupted Spren that bridge the gap between human and Parshendi. And one member of that couple is previously from and has close potential ties to that group of Parshendi Venli also brought Radiant Spren to. I don't know about you, but it seems to me that Brandon Sanderson is setting up an independent faction that will end up bridging the gap between the two factions we've come to know. I don't know how accurate I am, but I can easily see these different elements coming together and making this theory a reality. But of course, these theories have just been my opinion. What do you think about my theories, and what theories do you have for Stormlight Archive Book 5? Let me know in the comments below. Anyway, that has been it from me for now, guys. Thank you very much for watching, and if you enjoyed it, consider subscribing. As always, my name has been Raven, and I will see you next time. Take care, everybody.